we somehow go from seeing rocks and manipulating rocks to grasping a universal,
Yeah.
right? This universal claim that 2 + 2 = 4 and so on. And so how is that possible? Okay, that's the question. How is that possible? And, the Aristotelian tradition says something like, well, we have a power of abstraction. We have a faculty of abstraction where you can abstract from the particulars up to a universal. Here's another way. We already had an implanted version of that truth in our soul
Yeah.
from the time we came into being.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Settecase, and this is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today's episode is going to be all about Plato. Plato. I'm from the Midwest, so I say Play-Doh, but it's Plato. I just don't want to sound like an idiot. Either way, it sounds dumb. We're going to talk about Plato, and we're going to talk about who he was, his background, how to interpret his writings, but then also his arguments against like materialism, against relativism, subjectivism, and a little bit of Plato's theology. I'm really excited. I have with me Dr. David Talcott, and it's going to be great. He's just finished a book on this for the PNR Great Thinkers series, and I've had a number of those guys on to talk about their books, so I'm super stoked to do it again. Before we dive in, though, I have to commodify myself. So if you guys like this podcast, please consider becoming a Patreon patron. And like I'm talking to you guys. I know this always feels like a call to everyone else, but like if you like this, if it's your top 5 favorite podcasts, please consider becoming a Patreon patron. You can find the link in the description. If you're watching on YouTube, you can become a YouTube member and get all sorts of like special emojis and stuff to use of like my face and my dog and little cartoons that we have. All that good stuff. There's a bunch of different perks. You get to see early. You get to see episodes early. You get a glimpse into my podcast notes that I take. So all that good stuff. Buy some merch, all this stuff. Please support the podcast and help me feed my dog. All right. Without further ado, though, enough selling myself. Let's jump into Plato and all things Platonism. Dr. Talcott, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, man.
Thanks for having me.
Before we dive into like some Plato stuff, I always like to ask philosophers and theologians like how they got into their work. So, like, first of all, I guess how do you think of yourself? Are you a historian of philosophy? Are you a classical philosopher? Are you a philosopher simplicator? Like, how do you think of yourself there?
Yeah, I'm a philosopher who works on history of philosophy, so I'm definitely not a classicist. I'm an aspiring classicist, but yeah, I work on history of philosophy. But I teach a range of courses in philosophy. Like a lot of us do at small schools.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Awesome. And you're at the King's College there in New York, which
Yes.
my wife's uncle is all about the King's College. He went there and just obsessed. So shout out Uncle Lon.
Great.
Yeah.
Love to hear it.
That's right. Where'd you do your dissertational work at?
Yeah, so I did my undergrad at Hillsdale College and then my PhD at Indiana University,
Oh, sweet.
Bloomington. Yeah.
Awesome. What'd you do your dissertation on?
It was on Plato. Yeah, so I
Oh,
worked
dude.
on Plato's early dialogues, especially his Euthyphro, and made some kind of thorny arguments about that and the place of the Euthyphro in Plato's overall corpus. And as you know, there's endless discussions about different issues in Plato interpretation. So,
Right.
but it was a great excuse to just read Plato for a couple years and really think about those kinds of things.
So awesome. I love that. So you got this book coming out. I think it's probably just called like Plato in the Great
Yep.
Thinkers. So is this like directly from your dissertational work, or is this something brand new?
It was new. It's kind of come out of my teaching. I mean, it's really a almost popular level introduction to Plato. I've really written it to be accessible.
Yeah.
The kind of thing you could give to people in your church. You could use with, honestly, probably high school seniors. You could use
Yeah.
it with. So I really made it not just for experts, for philosophers, but really, I think in the spirit of the series, something broadly accessible. So I'd say it more comes out of my teaching, just thinking about what's
Mm.
valuable about Plato today. Why would a Christian want to read Plato if they weren't already interested in it?
Yeah.
And so to try to point out something that I think is pretty clear, that a lot of the philosophical issues we care about today and that have been a perennial interest to philosophers originated over 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
There are already arguments about relativism, materialism, skepticism, God, what human life is all about. These kinds of things, serious arguments happening about them 2,400 years ago. And
Yeah.
many of the views which are false and destructive were already, pretty thoroughly defeated, I think, by
Yeah.
Plato and Aristotle. And yet they keep coming back. So we have to keep discussing them.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
That's so fantastic. Some of my professors will point that out, and especially in Christian communities, we like to point that out that like, hey, Alfred North Whitehead was probably wrong about most of what he said, but he said everything's a footnote to Plato, and he's probably right about that. You could find the hard problem of consciousness back there. You can find the argument from reason, all this kind of like anti-materialism type stuff. It's already in Plato, and yeah, like you said, like it keeps coming up every generation, so you have to retool it or recontextualize it.
Mhm.
But it's not, it's not brand new. It's not made up. You can find the stuff all the way back
Yeah.
there.
There's
So cool.
always, I mean, each age has its own complexities to it. And obviously, modern scientific inquiry adds a lot of complexity to it.
Mm,
So it's not that there's nothing more to do. There's like tons to do.
yeah.
But there are, a certain set of basic alternatives on certain issues. And a number of those were initially explored, a long time ago.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like the way you wrote the book because it, like you said, it is kind of a popular introduction, but you're still going in on deep stuff that was new to me. And I've read a lot of books on Plato. I've read his dialogues, and it was really cool the way that you can. So it does show that it came out of your teaching because you're still teaching. It's not just like bare bones, boring. Like, okay, I've heard all this. It's like, no, this is fascinating new stuff. So I do commend the book and I appreciate it. One thing that you talked about in the beginning, you talk about people who beef with Plato, like contra Plato type stuff. So you got Nietzsche
Hmm.
on one side, and then you also mentioned Van Til and Frame, and that's kind of the school that I came out of. That's where I learned philosophy from Van Til, and then from Frame's giant book, and then kind of moving away from that. But he's getting hit from all different sides. Can you? What was Nietzsche's problem? Nietzsche's problem with Plato?
Yeah. Well, let me just say this too. One of the things I do in the introduction is just talk about how there are different views of the value of Plato. Like you
Hmm.
said, there are actually a number of supporters of Plato in history, and like I fall into that camp,
Yeah.
by and large. But there are both secular and Christian critics of Plato. Very very heavy critics. So one of the things I do is like, here's some Christians that like Plato. Here's some Christians that don't like Plato. If you're a Christian reading this book, I guess you have to think because you're going to have to decide between those two,
Yeah.
and then I make my arguments. But Nietzsche and others, a lot of others in the last 200 years in the West don't like Plato. I mean,
Hmm.
Plato represents all of the old terrible stuff that Nietzsche's against.
Right.
Things like truth, things like being, things like virtue in a philosophical sense, things like eternal souls, things like transcending the immanent. Nietzsche's against all this, right? This is all
Right.
terrible. So
That's right.
it's really funny. I mean, to me, it's funny the way Nietzsche runs things together. He's like Socrates, Jesus, Hegel, Kant, all this stuff's horrible. And so, and he was a student of Plato and the Pre-Socratics. He has lectures that survive, about even pre-Socratic philosophy.
Mm,
And so anyway, and Nietzsche's not a big fan.
yeah.
He likes the Pre-Socratics, but he doesn't like them so much for their content, their substantive arguments. So he's not like, yeah, Anaximander really had it going on with his theories.
Right.
He admires the spirit of the Pre-Socratics. He sees
Mm,
the Pre-Socratics as sort of the philosophical version of a Greek hero, and has that kind of heroic quality to their intellectual work,
yeah.
that is really a model for us. And then you get Socrates and Plato, and they're very pedestrian. They're domesticated. They sort of
Mm.
domesticate philosophy. So he wants to get back to some kind of ride of the Valkyries for philosophy, and for him that's the pre-Socratic. So he loves Heraclitus and things like that. So yeah, Nietzsche's a fascinating figure on this stuff. Not so much for, I think, sort of analytic arguments
Right.
about value of philosophy or Plato, but the spirit in which you can approach some of these different things.
Mm,
And you know, you don't really turn to Nietzsche for arguments. You turn to him for ways of looking at things, I think.
right.
So yeah.
Especially if you're a angsty 15-year-old. Who
Sure,
wants to
yeah, that
rebel
works,
rebel against your parents.
or even older, yeah,
Yeah,
but
no, that's
it
true,
works for
that's true.
that too.
Yeah, that's so good. Um, so for those like, people are gonna know who Plato is, but, can you fill us in? Like, who was he? I found that really fascinating as well, like, how much you were able to pack in the beginning, like, who is this guy?
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, we don't know a lot about his biography. Obviously, a lot of it is speculative, comes from later sources, like Diogenes Laertius, who's a bit of a sketchy source. But it's clear enough. The outline, some of the outlines are clear enough that he was born, an Athenian, so in Athens. He was born aristocratic. He lived a decently long life. There's an account that he lived to 81 years old.
Dang.
So he was probably either late teen, early 20s when Socrates was executed in 399. That was a pivotal moment for him when this person he admired was executed. Um, and so he lived through quite a bit during his lifetime. He was in his teenage years or early 20s when Athens loses the Peloponnesian War to Sparta. And sort of like being an aristocrat in a defeated country, it's a
Yeah.
weird thing. You have a lot of opportunity in one sense in the rebuild phase, but you're kind of beaten down. And in any case, he has a lot of, it's a very famous letter that he wrote, his ninth letter, where he describes the opportunities he had in the kind of aftermath of the fall of Athens, a lot of political turmoil. And at one point, this a political party gains control and kind of does a little mini coup.
Hmm.
And some of his relatives are part of the leaders of the coup.
Wow.
So he's like a young adult, fresh out of Harvard or whatever, and offered a job in this new administration, this new regime. And so he sees a lot when he's young and has a lot of opportunity. And mostly what he sees is everything goes south.
Yeah.
He sees his beloved teacher executed. He sees his friends get power, his relatives get power, and then rule just as corruptly as the
Mhm.
people before them did. And he says, "This is a problem. Political power without virtue is a problem,
Mm.
and political power without wisdom and goodness is a problem." And so he turns from politics to philosophy, and he pursues a course of philosophical writing and instruction. He founds a school in Athens at the academy, at the gymnasium there, that we still remember today with the term academy.
Yeah.
And so it goes on to influence so many people. Does this huge writing program of all these dialogues that survive to today, and that were compiled and studied by his future students. So definitely a remarkable figure. Even today, the way that his writings hang together is
Yeah.
um, pretty amazing, and the amount of engagement and intellectual oomph behind them is just uh, impressive.
Seriously impressive, yeah. Um, I can never remember everyone's names, like, all the pre-Socratics are always, like, Anaximenes and Anaximander, and then, like, you get, like, Aristotle, but I think is Plato's real name Aristocles, is that right?
See, now you're asking me a history question. I don't know. Maybe I have to look at my notes.
Yeah,
I'm not
that's so
lecturing right
good.
now.
That's
I
so
think
good.
it could. I'm not. I honestly don't remember that off the top of my
Yeah,
head.
that's right, there's so many of those floating around in my head, and I'm always like, "Oh, if I can pull one of those out, I sound
Yeah,
really
I
smart."
don't. I don't think so. But
Yeah, yeah,
this is where as philosophers we can just punt on these questions. When
exactly,
it
just
gets too tough,
stipulate.
we're just like, I don't remember. Let me ask my classicist friend.
That's so good, I love
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Always
Um
always have an out. You have to.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
great, man. I love that backdoor. So I've heard this too. This is another one that I've heard. Plato means like broad shouldered or something like that, and that he was like a wrestler. Have you
Yeah.
heard that one before?
Yeah, I mean, it means in general, it means broad.
Broad, yeah,
So
broad
there's
shouldered.
questions as to why. Is it broad shoulders? Was he a
Oh, is he
wrestler?
fat? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, fat doesn't seem to fit too well. Maybe does he have a big nose? There's speculation as to why he was
Oh yeah, I've heard the nose
broad. But
thing.
yeah, I'm partial to the idea that he was a physically fit guy. And
Heck yeah, man.
there's a whole story on that actually. If you think about the location of the academy, which kind of reflects young male education at the time.
Hmm.
They put the school in the gym in
Yeah,
the same spot.
that's awesome.
So, which fits with, if you've read the Republic and other things, that he talks about, it fits his developmental model.
Mhm.
You develop the body and the soul, and
Yeah.
you develop a lot of spiritual characteristics through bodily activities.
Mhm.
When you're wrestling, when you're competing and this and that, you're preparing for courage, because you're gonna need that later on when you fight for the city, but also you're gonna need that just when you have to, make decisions for the right reasons in the face of opposition,
Yeah.
as your, mayor of your little precinct, and things like that. So anyway, those two actually really go together, and there's a story there. And quite a few of his dialogues are actually set in a gymnasium setting. Not all
Mm.
of them, but there's a number of them that show real familiarity with
So
what
good.
goes on there, with like the saunas, with the kinds of, like I said, the wrestling, but also the different kind of track and field type activities, and the kind of male camaraderie that's there, as well as the genuine discussions about life
Mhm.
and about success and like what you want for the future, the kind of people you are now, all the little social bizarre things and back and forths that go on.
Yeah.
He shows a real familiarity with that in his writings. So,
I love that. I grew up, wrestling since 1st grade, and now I do jujitsu, and we have these conversations, and I'm like, "Yes, like, this is what Plato was doing," and then I think about what was over the academy door, like, something about, like, if those ignorant of geometry don't enter here. I'm like, "Well, let me just forget about that part. I hate geometry. I don't want let me just focus on the physical and the philosophy more."
well, we can come back to geometry eventually if you want. That's in the grad school studies. Maybe you're just still at the physical training
That's right.
stage, and not ready for that yet. But no, geometry's yeah, pretty important in his model.
Yeah,
Mathematics is.
yeah. I'm working on it myself, but, yeah, it's an uphill battle. S
Well, we're all works in progress.
That's right. Amen. Thank you. Um, you brought up this Socratic problem, and that's the problem of deciphering. Well, let me put it out there and see if I got it right. It's
Mhm.
like the problem of deciphering. Like, is this Plato, or is this Socrates? Is Socrates just his mouthpiece, or are these actual works? Are these actual ideas from that Plato got from his teacher Socrates? Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's pretty much right. The problem is most of what Plato wrote is in dialogue form,
Hmm.
and Plato himself is not one of the characters.
Yeah.
And when someone writes in dialogues, you can't automatically assume that like the protagonist represents the author's own point of view. You can write a protagonist that has a protagonist has a different point of view than the author.
Yeah.
And so we're confronted with this issue of, um, Plato's not a character. Socrates is a character in most of the dialogues, not all, but many of them. Does the character of Socrates represent Plato's views, or is the character of Socrates just the character of Socrates meant to teach us something, and that
Right.
Plato himself is in the background of the whole thing?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, this is in general a problem with Plato interpretation, and the Socratic problem is kind of like the problem of the historical Jesus, the problem of the historical Socrates. What did
Mm,
the actual there was an actual person Socrates. What did he believe? What did he do? And we have to piece that together from other things, because Plato wrote about him, Xenophon wrote about him, other
yeah.
people wrote
Same.
about him, but Socrates didn't write any of his own. So there's sort of these problems. It's these problems interconnected, right? These problems of the historical Socrates, then these problems of Plato, the author, and the thinker. And
Yeah.
usually, people who work on these areas have a view about the whole picture and how to fit it all together.
Yeah, and I've heard this one before, and appreciate it in your book that there's
Mm.
early, middle, and late writings of Plato, and then there's you brought up at least two ways of reconciling them. There's
Mhm.
developmentalism, and then there's Unitarianism, which for the Christians are their hackles are going up, but it's not that
Yeah.
kind of thing. Can you help us out with these two?
Yeah. So it's standard practice now to divide Plato's dialogues into those three groups, usually called early, middle, and late. And there's a number of ways in which that division is done. Some of it goes back to stylometry, which is kind of study of grammatical and linguistic features of the dialogues.
Hmm.
So, for example, how many unusual words appear in a dialogue, like words that are very, very rare in Greek? Um, is you can imagine, as someone sort of develops their writing style, they might change how they do that.
Yeah.
And later, his later dialogues have more of those rare words than earlier ones, and there's
Mm.
various reasons for that. Um, so you can do it on stylometry, which has to do not just with that, but with other kinds of details like that, to divide it into 3 periods. And then you can tell the order of the 3 periods in a number of ways. For one, we know that we're pretty confident he was working on the laws when he died. It looks unfinished, and there's a testimony that that's what he was working on when he died. So works that are like the laws go in the late period. And then for the other 2 periods, early and the middle, you can tell a difference in the complexity and the scope of things, like from the Republic and the Phaedo as middle period dialogues versus things like the Apology and the Euthyphro, which are
Mm.
early period dialogues. So it's not like there's no controversy over the
Right.
division, but it is a widely accepted way to break them up. And then the question becomes, how to understand the relationship between the three.
Mhm.
In Plato's own development, does he change and go through like 3 phases? That's a standard view. The developmental view says that, where in the early period, he's a young writer, still kind of exploring his own ideas, and he writes in order to memorialize and honor his teacher Socrates. And so he writes Socratic dialogues in the spirit of Socrates, the way that Socrates talked about things.
Yeah.
Not necessarily eyewitnesses recordings or like transcripts or anything, but just arguments in the style of Socrates. And then the theory goes, as he works through those, he starts to have his own ideas, not just memorializing Socrates, but saying, hey, here's how we're going to answer these questions that Socrates had, these questions about knowledge, questions about virtue. And so you get the middle period dialogues like the Republic, the Phaedo, the Phaedrus, Symposium, that have a lot of the kind of
Yeah.
classic Plato ideas in them. And that's when he reaches his maturity, and he gives you the full theory of the forms and the two worlds, and these things he's known for. And then in the late period, there's the view that he's kind of reconsidering his mature views, maybe identifying problems that are unresolved with them, as well as, I think, developing more interest in natural philosophy and physics and things like that. Um, so that's kind of the developmental side of things.
Yeah.
The other side, which I lean towards in general a little bit more,
Okay.
is more Unitarian or
Mhm.
uniformitarian view, which says, yes, there are some differences that you can find at different points, and not necessarily denying all development, but arguing that in general the development is overblown, and
Mm.
that a lot of the differences between the different dialogues can be understood as part of a literary program that Plato was undertaking
Mm.
to intentionally expose people to his ideas in a more realistic and pedagogically productive way. So maybe you don't find talk about the forms in some of the early dialogues. That's because he's getting you ready for them in the middle period dialogues.
Mm.
And so the disputes on this are endless. You could do your whole career on this. There are books on this, and some of it is probably angels dancing on the head of a pin. We probably don't need
Sure.
to like spend. I don't think we should spend our whole life on this, although I've spent probably too much time on it already.
Yeah.
But it does kind of bear on how to think about how the dialogues fit together. So it is an interesting project. But you're sort of faced with it when you read the dialogues, because you're like, wow, I mean, some of these dialogues end in confusion and aporia. You don't
Yeah.
you end with no answer. That's annoying. What's up with that? Why did Plato write it that way? So he's really like forcing you to engage with him as an author, and
Mhm.
so these questions are really prompted for us.
Totally. Yeah. I think it's fascinating that he focused so much on dialogues, and that I think this was in your book as well, that like that was intentional. He's like, no, this is the way to do it. This is the way to philosophize. It's through these dialogues. And I don't know about rumors or whatever, but I've heard it said that like Socrates didn't want any of his stuff written down. Plato's like, yeah, yeah, sure. Anyways, let me write this down. But so then he does dialogues, and then his student Aristotle is like, he's not an analytic philosopher because that's like super not there yet, but he's more like rigorous and like, I'm going to tell you what's up, and here's it, word for word. We're gonna lay out arguments and stuff. Um, what do you make of those like three completely different styles, all from like within a generation or two?
Yeah. No, I mean, you're right. It's a really interesting contrast. Socrates didn't write anything. Obviously, he could have, but he didn't. I don't think we really know why. I think that's a little bit of
Mm,
a stretch. We can speculate, and everyone's entitled to their speculations.
sure.
The thing about Plato is, I would say he could have written what Aristotle wrote in the sense that he could have written treatises.
Yeah.
I mean, you can tell by the way the dialogues are put together, the way that there are such rigorous arguments inside of them. He basically had to kind of do what Aristotle does and then turn it into a dialogue.
Right.
And so it adds kind of an extra pedagogical feature. How do I draw people into this and sort of portray realistically how you would get into an argument with this? And how would I take somebody who maybe isn't on board initially and move them to the conclusion? What are
Yeah.
some premises they would likely agree with, and then I can move them towards my conclusion. But stylistically, it is a great question. There were other dialogues around this same time that were
Okay.
written, including even dialogues with Socrates as a character.
Hmm.
Charles Kahn has a great book, Plato and the Socratic Dialogue, that really goes through some of these other Socratic dialogues that are out there. So it was a known genre.
Okay.
Dialogues with Socrates. It was a thing, and prose writing, obviously, like Aristotle did, was certainly a thing with the historians and the sophists were writing, and the medical doctors. So there's precedent for that as well.
Okay.
But it certainly seems like a kind of almost temperamental difference, or just kind
Yeah.
of overall approach to philosophy difference.
Totally. Yeah, I've seen it compared to like the continental analytic divide today. That like Aristotle would be like the analytic, and Plato, his style at least of using more metaphors and dialogues and those kind of thing. That's what maybe the continentals do more. I don't know. I'm more of an analytic
Yeah.
myself, so I'm like, don't do that with my boy Plato. But um,
Yeah, it's he does like to use the imagery. I just think of Plato as perfectly balanced, right? The perfect mixture of the analytic rigor as well as
yeah,
recognizing we're not just brains on sticks. There's the
sure.
whole other side of the soul, which also needs to be convinced.
Mm,
And it's because he's interested in virtue and he's interested in the well-being of the whole community. And it's not enough just to have solid arguments in order for that to work.
yeah,
You have to move the whole person, not
yeah,
just the mind. The mind is a crucial part of it. It's an essential part of it, but you got to move the whole soul. So you've got to make it beautiful, and you've got to make it attractive in order for it to really be compelling. So
yeah.
he's trying to do that as well.
I think that's a really good model that a lot of philosophers can learn today. Not learn, I'm sure they already know it, right? But like the sci-fi authors are the ones who get all the philosophy into culture. Like everyone knows cogito ergo sum because of like Philip K. Dick and because of Blade Runner and stuff. And it's in there deep. And yeah, maybe they learned it in high school, but there's no way they're remembering it if it's not in those movies. And like, Dostoevsky's dialogues that he's interjecting or like C.S. Lewis's like novels just taking off. And he's like, no, there's philosophy in there. There's theology and philosophy. They're latent in there. I'm going in the back door. And I wanna encourage, like, my analytic friends, like, "Hey, you got some good stuff to say. Can you write it in, like, a short story? Can you do that for" like, that would be fantastic, you know?
Yeah, it's tough, right? I mean, that skill
Super
set's
tough.
that's a big skill set. I kind of
That's right.
feels like we should have teams, right? Like we should
Mm,
have teams of artists and philosophers working together. That seems
that's
like
a
the right
good
way to do
point.
it.
Holy cow.
But along with some exceptional people that can pull
Yeah.
it off. I mean, I think we need to have that.
Wow, I didn't think about
And
that.
yeah.
Having a team would be amazing. Yeah, you're like the sci-fi, like, short story
Yeah.
guy. "Here's some good philosophy for you. Let's work together." Oh, man, that sounds
Yeah,
so cool.
in some ways that's kind of what the academy was. I mean, not in the full artistic spirit of it, but um the academy was a team, right? It was like a school, like a
Yeah.
faculty and student body. And so they're kind of working together on this joint project. And I
Mm,
will say we are sort of going beyond Plato at this point. We're talking about not just obviously movies, there were no movies, but like putting on plays or things like that. Like,
yeah.
yes, he wrote dialogues. He didn't really write dramas though. So
Right.
the dialogue has its own drama to it. Of course, and I'd love to talk about that in the
Yeah.
different dialogues. But even his sort of artistic scope was very, rational in outlook. It still keeps that element. So, but I think
Yeah.
kind of pushing it beyond he kind of invites that. He says the politicians should be speaking in a way that builds virtue in the
Mm,
people, and the artists should be doing their art in such a way that builds virtue in their people. And so I think it's in the spirit of Plato to do
yeah,
this.
that's good. Yeah, and maybe going beyond Plato's dialogue of every now and then his interlocutor, "You're absolutely right. You're 100% correct." And like, "Well, I
Yeah,
don't know. This is how realistic, but whatever."
right.
Um,
Yeah, some of it's very ham-fisted, right? Some
right,
of it's
right.
sort of like just this could have been a treatise. And look, at some points, Socrates breaks into very long, monologues. He goes
Mhm.
on for pages at times. So
Yeah,
Plato's not above doing that.
yeah,
But there are some of the dialogues where the action is really relevant to
totally.
what's going on. You think about the Phaedo, which is the dialogue where he dies. Socrates is executed,
Mhm.
and to see the closeness that's there between Socrates and his friends is part of what makes the whole thing very moving. Socrates' clear love for his friends and his friends'
Yeah,
love for him. Um, in the symposium, which is at this drinking party, this dinner party, the character of Alcibiades shows up about 2/3 of the way through and basically just drunkenly crashes the party.
right.
And that illustrates a lot in the kind of thing, that Plato's talking about, that Socrates is warning against.
Yeah,
Love gone wrong instead of love gone right. And so it's a modest amount of drama, the little bit of action that's there,
right, right.
but it usually has, quite a bit of meaning to it. So
Yeah,
that's a whole fun little area to like try to read up on and think about why did he have that little piece of action? Because it's usually not random.
yeah, yeah. The symposium makes me queasy sometimes because 'cause they're talking like, the things that they're talking about and, like, gratifying their love. I'm like, "Dude, please." But, I wanted to ask, do you got a favorite dialogue? Don't say symposium.
That's a tough one. It probably changes depending on what I'm teaching. I
Mm,
think it's rotated over the years.
yeah,
What I found is there's quite a few that I admire more and more the more that I read them. So do I have
yeah,
one? Not really.
yeah.
I usually right now recommend the Gorgias as a
Oh,
kind of
man. That's
introduction
it's one of my
introduction to
favorites.
his work. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's a nice introduction in a lot of ways.
It's kind of well, so I've heard it said that it's like a short version of what the heck? Of his big one.
The
Like,
Republic
The Republic,
probably is
yeah,
what.
my
Yeah,
goodness. Yeah,
yeah.
because it's on, like, justice, right? Like, maybe. I don't know, you're the expert here.
Well, it's a central concern. I mean, he doesn't quite foreground it in the exact same way, but I actually think it's very much written as preparation for the Republic,
Okay,
as
cool.
sort of softening you up to the idea of it,
Yeah,
of what's going to happen in the Republic in a way that's a little less metaphysically involved, in a way that's a little more politically oriented from the beginning.
yeah.
So
And
yeah,
much shorter, like, you can read it
yeah, that's
in a
right,
day.
that's right.
Yeah,
It's you can read it in a day. It's still not short. Like, he has some short dialogues you can read in a sitting,
yeah.
but it's still a substantial work.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think that's one that I teach regularly now that I really that I really appreciate. There's a lot packed in there into that little dialogue.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, so you break down this little book into I say little, but it's packed full of good stuff. Into these really great chapters: for the spiritual, against materialism; for truth, against relativism; for virtue, against hedonism, and like it's really fantastic. I wanted to talk about for the spiritual against materialism here. Um, you mentioned, I think probably in the intro as well, that Augustine, appreciated Plato, and that was one of the, Christians on the side of that. But then he like recants that later in his life. Um, but not, maybe not wholly, right? Like, so some people might point to that and be like, look, Augustine said that he was totally wrong. And that's like, not really. I think if correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like he was just like, I shouldn't have gone in that far into Platonism and Neoplatonism. Like, what do you make of Augustine's, recantation, I guess, of that?
Yeah. No, I think I read it in the way that you're describing there, where he does think he was a little overboard enthusiastic at one point in his youth because of the role that Platonists played in helping him to reach Christianity, just as part of his intellectual
Right.
and spiritual journey. But I don't see the end as like a complete, rejection of
Hmm.
Platonism, but more. I mean, the way that Augustine did all these retractions at the end of his life is kind of a remarkable thing as its own thing. Very few of us, get to our old age and decide to publish. Here's where I was wrong. Everything I was wrong about in one book.
Right.
I was too laudatory of Plato. You know, I see him just as saying something like that. So yeah, not that he's like anti-Plato by the end of it. I
Right.
don't see that.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, you got materialists, before Plato and then, like, during
Yeah,
Plato. I think before would be like Thales and Anaximander and Exemenes. Um, Everything's water,
yeah,
maybe neutral monism, and then, like, everything's air. I hadn't considered this because 'cause I'm always focusing on, like, the atomists of the time, but I guess, yeah, Thales was, like, a materialist because he thought everything was water. It's pretty fascinating.
yeah. I mean, obviously, there are disputed questions of interpretation about
Sure.
some of the early pre-Socratics, but I think one of the main ways of reading these guys is they were at least pretty far down the materialist line to say something
Yeah.
like everything is made out of water
Yeah.
is a kind of materialist view,
Mhm.
and it's obviously not one that won a lot of subscribers over the
Hmm.
years, but it's definitely a proto materialism, and and there's a story that's pretty continuous from them up through Democritus and Epicurus, who are really the materialists in a full blown sense with their materialist atoms.
Mm.
So atomism is kind of the most sophisticated version of materialism that you get. So I go back and forth because there's the early guys. I don't know how kind of if I want to say they're systematically clear enough to be full blown materialists. I think
Sure.
that's reading back a little bit into them, but they're moving down that pathway, and trying to explain the world, right? Why are things happening the way they're happening here?
Mhm.
If you say they're happening the way they're happening because of the properties of material stuff, namely this, everything's made out of, everything really is water. That's why things happen the way they happen. It's water,
Yeah.
right? Or things happen the way they're happening because everything is air, or things happen the way they're happening because everything is atoms, right?
Yeah.
So that it is moving towards a like a materialist explanation. It's not about Zeus being mad at you. It's not about failing to do the sacrifices last week,
Yeah.
right? It's about the rational structure, the material structure. Right? Maybe rational is not the right word, but the
Mm.
material structure. It's a structural thing.
Yeah.
The material features of the stuff around us is what's making things happen the way that they're happening.
Mm.
And that's again, I think you see that in the ancient Greek world in the fullest sense with the atomists. They're the
Yeah.
most consistent and clear, and also the most I think sophisticated materialist account that comes to be there. And by the time of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, you do have Democritus, who has put forward a pretty clear, unambiguous materialist picture.
Yeah. Yeah. Except like the free will part where you're like, the atom swerves, and you're like, wait,
Well,
how does that lead to free will?
free
But
will
yeah,
creates a lot of problems, especially later on in the history story. Um, but yeah, you turns out when you try to go with a hard materialist line on certain issues, you have explanatory problems.
yeah,
That's the problem you run into.
totally. Um, so one of the hard things about having a podcast is like you read people's names a lot. Like all of us read people's names, and we have a way that we say it in our head, and then you have to say it out loud, and you're like, "Well, I don't know." So it's
Yep.
Democritus is fine. We all get that one. But then another Adamus is it's like Leucippus or something. Do you
Yeah, Leucippus is
Leucippus?
fine. Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, you can say the hard K for the C. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So so these are like the famous atomists, and um it's funny because, like, we called atoms, what we have today in our physics, atoms, like,
Mhm.
thinking that that's what they're it's, like, the same thing, and then we're like, "No, you can split that up," and it's like, well, that's not what the atomists thought. The atomists are like, whatever can't be split, if it's a superstring, whatever is down, like, there's something fundamental, so we don't it's kinda funny that we said, "This is the thing, this is the atom," and you split it and make, huge bombs and stuff. You're like, "Well, those
Right.
idiots," like, "No, you're an idiot for labeling that preemptively."
Yeah, I mean, that's right. The ancient atoms, really pre-modern atoms, this is the same idea of atoms that survives from antiquity down to, the early modern period.
Mhm.
The idea of a tiny, uncuttable, unsplittable, unbreakable piece of matter.
Yeah.
That's what an atom is supposed to be. up until at least 1700s.
Hmm.
And when it breaks down in 1800s, I'd have to ask a historian of physics to give me
Yeah.
which experiment is the one that does it. But
Yeah.
it's pretty late. And obviously, it turns out that's not the case in pretty weird ways, in modern physics. So they use the same word, atom and atom, but they certainly, the ancients meant something very different by it, and to me, something that's more actually kind of more clearly a materialist picture, right? I mean, if you
Yeah.
have a little solid piece of thing, an atom, that's matter. Okay, I can understand that. If you start talking about other things being material, then it gets a little weird, right? Like, is a string material? I mean,
I
yeah,
know.
okay.
Yeah, I know. A
But even
wave
you
function,
can
like,
even you're right. That's matter, right? That's
yeah,
that's material. I mean, if you
crazy.
ask Democritus, is a wave function matter? He's going to say no.
Hmm.
And if you ask Democritus, is a force? Let's just go back to forces, right? Let's
Yeah.
just go to Newton, okay?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Is a force material? The answer is no, right? I
Yeah.
mean, things move around, things can bump into other things.
Yeah.
They agreed on that, but all there are is the things moving. Okay, so there's solid stuff, the atoms, there's empty space, and there's the solid things moving.
Yeah.
But that's just nothing over and above the solid thing.
Right.
So obviously, this turns into problems when you try to just describe it geometrically and do your physics as pure geometry. This is one of the things that happens in the 1600s, as it becomes clear there's stuff like force and momentum, and
Yeah.
you transfer momentum not just on size but on mass and things like that. Um, so in any case, the things that count as, and to me, the things that count as material today are very unclear.
Yeah.
And an ancient materialist would have said that's not material. At least
Totally.
this is my reading of it. Yeah,
I'm with you on that. Um, yeah, there's oh shoot, there's a paradox about this, but I can't remember it, so I don't get to sound smart. That's okay. People will know what I'm talking about, hopefully. So, um, so Plato argues against the atomists, or, like, this broader camp of materialists, whether that includes the pre-Socratics or not, with beauty, right? Like,
yeah.
how does that one's so fascinating to me. Can you lay that out for us?
Yeah, I use beauty as an example in the book, but it really works for a number of different forms or essences or other things. But the basic way I structure the argument in the book, which I think is summarizing how he approaches it in a number of different places, is that there are things that are real and that exist, but that are not reducible to matter.
Yeah.
And so there are things that exist that are not reducible to particular material things. And so there's a number of pieces bound up with this, but beauty is a nice illustration because beauty is so I would say abstract, in the sense
Yeah.
that lots of different kinds of things can be beautiful and lots of different features of things can make them beautiful. So is a diamond ring beautiful? No, absolutely. Is the Empire State Building beautiful? I think it is.
Hmm.
And yet one is tiny and one is big, right? One is shiny and one is dull. And so they're very different physical attributes, different colors, different shapes, different sizes, different perceptual qualities of them, right? Like
Yeah.
every kind of five sensory thing you can see from them and perceive from them is like very, very different. And yet they're both beautiful. And our
Yeah.
mind can grasp that they are both beautiful.
Mhm.
And obviously, many other things can be beautiful as well. So just thinking about things like that gets you to realize there are things that are real that are not reducible to the purely physical.
Yeah.
Um, and this again is bound up with his distinction between particulars and forms
Mhm.
or essences. And he argues that the things that we perceive are always particular, that is, perceived with the senses. We're perceiving a particular ring, a particular set of colors, and so forth. And yet we can talk about things that are more than just the particular thing in front of us. We can see one diamond ring and we can talk about rings. And that refers to not just this thing, like the name of this ring, but all rings, what it is to be a ring.
Right.
And so he argues that just from reflecting on experience, right? Reflecting on our experience leads us to the conclusion there are things that are real that are not merely particular and not merely sensory, right?
Yeah.
Not merely things with material, just materiality that we can perceive. Um, and so he calls them essences or forms, right?
Yeah.
Essence is really just our translation of being. He calls them beings,
Yeah.
usia. So they are the things that are in the most fundamental way, and they are forms or sometimes translated ideas, which I don't like, but for various reasons. But
Yeah.
forms or essences.
The ideal. Yeah. Our idea means something so different to us today. And something
Yeah,
being ideal is like we totally ruin that word.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well.
So he has with beauty and other things, he has the individual beautiful things,
Yeah.
and then he has the form or essence of beauty, which is what it is to be, right? What it is to be beautiful. And
Hmm.
that's we would say now like instantiated in lots of different particular beautiful objects.
Yeah.
But what it is not reducible to it. It has attributes that are not just the attributes of the particular thing.
Yeah.
And then he has a lot more he says from there. But that's how you can kind of just from reflecting on your perceptions and thinking about your experience, start moving yourself towards realizing there has to be a bigger structure and order to the world than just the particular material features I see in front of me.
Yeah. That's so good. So, this might tie into your the piece of the chapter, the portion on knowledge.
Hmm.
Does Plato, does he think that we can know individual like items of sense, or are we only knowing the forms? Like, because his sense of knowledge is like probably a lot different than what we might just take to be knowledge today.
Yeah, this is an area that Plato scholars are working on right now. That I do think the use of language in antiquity is a little bit different than what we do now, right? So we have
Sure.
a certain story that we tell ourselves about knowledge, at least in the current analytic tradition, knowledge as justified true belief, and then all the challenges that emerge
Yeah.
to
Plus
that over the
something.
last few decades. And so then you think about what this justification condition really has to consist in. You get other kinds of accounts of knowledge in terms of regularity theories, proper functioning, and,
Mhm.
and so forth. Um, so in antiquity, they have a range of words that are related to knowledge, and uh, different different thinkers are inclined to call different kinds of things knowledge. I would say that's one way to put it.
Yeah.
And when it comes to and so I say this, there's ongoing research in like what knowledge means for the Stoics, for the Aristotelians, and others. I actually think um, we shouldn't just simply assume they have this binary concept like beliefs can be turned into knowledge and knowledge ranges over all objects or other things like that. Anyway, I think
Yeah.
it's if you have grad students that want fun dissertations, there's interesting things to do in this area.
Okay.
But for Plato himself, he's very stingy with what he wants to call knowledge,
Right.
and he thinks that there are gradations of being, and that as you go from more real things to less real things, and I know the analytic philosophers are freaking out at this point as well.
That's right.
Um, but again, before modernity, this was very normal, right? There's degrees of being. All the medievals thought this way. The
Yeah.
Plato and Aristotle thought this way. So as you move from more real things to less real things, your ability to intellectually grasp those things um, has to change in accordance with the nature of the thing that it is grasping. And so things that are so to get to Plato, for things that are eternal and unchanging, the way you can know them or grasp them is much more stable and permanent
Mm.
because they are the same and unchanging.
Yeah.
Whereas things that are less real and more changeable are things that you're not going to be able to grasp in the same way. So
Yeah.
take a distinction that current philosophers are usually fine with, um, something like an a priori truth versus an a posteriori truth. Okay, so take a claim like there are 5 chairs in this room. If you want to know whether that's true or not, you're going to have to go check.
Right.
And if we utter that statement in a week, well, we have to go check again because we don't know. Okay, so that's a kind of claim that Plato would say you can't know. You can't
Hmm.
know that there are 5 chairs in this room, even if there are 5 chairs in this room.
Yeah.
He agrees, even if there are 5 chairs, he would agree there are 5 chairs in this room, but your mental grasp of that is very limited.
Hmm.
You're not doing anything wrong. You're doing everything right.
Just
You're
not
not
that kind of thing you can
you're
know.
not dreaming,
Right.
but it's the kind of thing where you have to come back tomorrow and check again, and you have to come back tomorrow and you have to check again.
Yeah.
Whereas if we move to what we would call today an a priori truth, things change. So if I ask you, if we take a proposition like, sorry, I'm treating you like a student. If I ask
No,
you,
it's awesome, man. This is
if
great.
take a
Yeah.
proposition like 2 + 2 = 4, it would say, well, that's true, and I know that that's true.
Yeah.
And if you come back in a week, do you have to check that again? No, right? You don't
Mhm.
have to check that. So guess what? Your belief that 2 + 2 = 4 is going to be able to have an epistemic stability to it
Yeah.
in a way that your belief that there are 5 chairs in the room does not.
Yeah.
And so Plato says, guess what? When you learn these truths about what things are, you're learning about something that doesn't change.
Mm.
When you learn that horses are animals, right? That's about the relationship between two different essences, two different natures.
Yeah.
You have learned something that doesn't change next year, right?
Mhm.
You have acquired knowledge that is very, very, very stable, right? He would say, completely stable. Once you can see the reason why,
Yeah.
right, which is not quite justification condition or something, but once you can see the account of the reason why, that is what
Sure.
makes it to be that way, right?
Yeah.
What it is in the being of the thing that requires it to be that way. Once you can see that, you don't have to go check again whether
Mhm.
there's 5 chairs here, right? Or whether horses are really animals. Horses are
Yeah.
animals. It doesn't matter, what Putin does next year. It doesn't matter, you know, where you go on vacation. Like horses are still animals, and,
Yeah.
and nothing's going to change that. So you can have a much higher grasp of that. So when it comes to essences, he gives his highest stamp of approval to those. You can know those. You can have episteme of those.
Okay. Yeah, I'm always confused about this part of Plato. Are you so you got the forms, and the forms, I think Plato or Platonists usually say exemplified and the Aristotelians say instantiated, but whatever the case, they're let's say the forms are exemplified. The form of horse is exemplified in this particular horse. Does for Plato, do you think that he is grasping that form by looking at this particular horse, or is it that doctrine of recollection where you're remembering from your time in the third realm or wherever?
Yeah. Well, so given that there are these things like what it is to be a horse, and given that what that is always more than any particular horse or set of horses you encounter, you now have an epistemic puzzle.
Hmm.
The puzzle is, how could we possibly learn what a horse is, what it is to be a horse,
Right.
when we not only have not experienced all actual horses, we certainly can't experience all possible horses. And even if we could, it's still, even that's not quite getting at the what it is to be. So how
Right.
do we how do we learn, how do we even grasp these kinds of truths? And again, that's kind of I don't know, horses are kind of weird, but even just take mathematical truths as a nice analog that we're more comfortable with some of these discussions.
Oh, that's good
How do
because when you said what
Yeah,
what it is to be, I thought maybe you're going with the consciousness thing, but you're talking more like
no.
the quiddity or whatever, like the thisness of
Well,
the.
yeah, I mean, not the particular thisness, but it's nature or essence.
Yeah, there's like
Um,
hexaity and then there's like
yeah.
quiddity, right? You're talking about quiddity?
So the
Okay.
hexaity comes in much later in the story. We don't have that anywhere yet.
Right.
Um, but yeah, the essence or form,
Okay.
um,
This is
uh,
good.
it's nature. So uh, yeah, so if you take something like 2 + 2 = 4, in practice, in experience, we learn that by manipulating little sticks or little rocks, and we
Yeah.
see little pictures on our worksheet in kindergarten, and we
Right.
sort of do that. But even today, psychologists, cognitive scientists don't really know how we acquire these concepts, or at least this is my read on it. I mean, I'm
Sure.
sure some of them have great theories and stuff, but we somehow go from seeing rocks and manipulating rocks to grasping a universal,
Yeah.
right? This universal claim that 2 + 2 = 4, and so on. And so, how is that possible? Okay, that's the question. How is that possible? And the Aristotelian tradition says something like, well, we have a power of abstraction. We have a faculty of abstraction where you can abstract from the particulars up to a universal.
Right.
And you see something like this in Aquinas. You see something like this as late as John Locke. This is a widespread view.
I wonder, and like
It's
David Armstrong's like a modern proponent of this type of stuff. I don't know if he goes into the epistemic realm of it, but he does talk about like the forms being in like an
Yeah,
Aristotelian sense here
yeah.
in
I
this.
don't know about the epistemic side of things. That goes beyond what I've read. But
Sure.
I mean, he's an example of someone who thinks there's laws and or forms or things like that,
Yeah.
scientific. universals
Universals,
with
yeah.
these things.
Okay.
Um, so I forget where my line of
I
argument
I
was
knocked
going
you off
now,
track.
but
You were going,
I was
epistemic
going
with
for
it.
the grand finale. Yeah.
Dang, man, I ruined
Um,
it. You were
but yeah,
going.
we had our 2 + 2 = 4.
Yes.
We were trying to
You're
figure
talking
out,
about,
okay, we had the power of
Aristotelians.
abstraction. Okay, so yeah, how do we go from the particulars to the universals?
Yep.
One way of viewing that is you have this power of abstraction.
Mhm.
Here's another way. We already had uh, uh, an implanted version of that truth in our soul
Yeah.
from the time we came into being. And that's the Platonic answer, is
Mhm.
that not learning and acquiring knowledge is a process of recollecting universal truths already embedded in the soul.
Yeah.
Prior to our existence on earth, that we had direct access to these universal rational truths, which we then, through a process of engaging with the world, seeing different things, and going through an intellectual process, come to remember.
Mm.
Um, now, this has not been a super popular view. So some rationalists in history have adopted it, but it's certainly not the majority view. But I usually tell my students, okay, if you don't like that view, then come up with a better answer.
Right.
And it's not easy. It's really not easy. And calling it a power of abstraction is as good as anything else. I really feel like the cog-sci people can trace some of the contours of that,
Yeah.
but it really is a pretty unique human power, that Plato and Aristotle recognize, that we can form these universal concepts that apply to all possible horses, and all
Yeah.
possible twos, and things like that. So yeah, knowledge is recollection, not super popular. Requires pre-existence of the soul. That's a problem for Christians. So
Yeah.
Christians don't really go in for that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But it is a real puzzle how we learn, and it's a reasonable. I mean, not my preferred, but it's an option.
Yeah.
And as with philosophy, if you have to make a kind of suspicious move, but it solves a lot of big problems for you,
Right.
well, you're like, hey, look at all these other big problems you have. I solved these really big problems. I have this other problem, but I don't think it's as bad as these other really big problems. You can see, I think you can see the doctrine of knowledge as recollection as fitting that. And it also fits his overall kind of really spiritual view of the world, where
Yeah.
we came from a divine realm and we're going back to a divine realm if we're properly prepared for it. So it actually is consistent with his view on other things, and maybe not as much of a theoretical cost as it would be for some
Right.
other philosophers.
Totally. So I was checking my book back here because Peter Geach has this like takedown of abstractionism in his book called Mental Acts, and so like I think abstractionism kind of bunk because you have to have the concept if you're going to go find it out there in the world. But so like you got this innatism or nativism that like they're preloaded, but it's like, well, that seems like theism, like where there's some teleology there. I don't know if I like that. And there's various views on concept acquisition, and I think all of them lead back to creator God, which is fantastic. So I love this area. It's so good. But I wanted to ask about the recollection view. So
Mhm.
and maybe Christians don't have to be as upset about it, but maybe still. Um, God had us like in mind. I mean, it depends on what you mean by that, right? But like, he says that. I think it's in Isaiah where he's like, "Yeah,
Sure.
I had you in mind." And like, well, what else does he have in mind? Well, I think if you're a Platonist about forms and you're a theist of any stripe, like you don't want to say those are outside of God and he has to pull from them in order to be creative. Like you want to say those are at least like in his mind. Either he invented them or they're an aspect of his being. So like if they're in his mind and the concept of you is in his mind beforehand, like I don't know, maybe we could Christianize this recollection and it wouldn't be so bad, but maybe that's a big problem.
Well, I mean, I don't know. It's certainly not a problem for God to know all these things. That's great.
Yeah.
It's more of a puzzle of how he creates us and what kind of capacities he gives to us, and what it even means for it to like possess this knowledge in our soul before we exist.
Right.
Um, so I don't, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I don't see a lot in it that's the particular Platonist features that are attractive to Christians. But certainly, there's no problem with any of the divine knowledge. But I think there's more to his view than just God knows all these things ahead of time, right? The idea is more like your soul actually subsists
Yeah.
prior to becoming embodied as an individual thing.
Yeah.
And the way he's thinking about it is you have like sort of direct, unmediated access to this spiritual, rational realm. You see all these eternal truths, and then in the confusing process of getting embodied, you forget,
Yeah.
forget so many of them, and you have to
Right.
climb back up,
Exactly.
to God. So it's really not that those pieces of it I don't think are super attractive, although I still prefer them to like the atomist views. I mean, think about what the alternative is. I mean, so the
Yeah.
other alternative is stuff like the Homeric gods.
Mhm.
Okay, that's also not very attractive for various reasons. And then these hardcore materialist views, which are like all you are is a collection of atoms,
Yeah.
and you had no spiritual meaning before you existed. After you die, your atoms are scattered and you are gone, and there's no experiencing after you're dead,
Mhm.
and there's nothing good or bad for you after you die. So Plato, I don't like the pre-existence of the soul, but he has the post-existence of the soul as
Yeah.
well, which is
Yeah.
pretty great,
Yeah.
and a lot of moral significance to it. I mean, his
Yeah.
whole view involves thinking that the condition of your soul in this life directly influences the condition of your soul in the next life.
Mhm.
And if you are corrupt and vicious, and if you dominate others and steal from others and exploit others in this life, the next life is not looking good for you.
Right.
And if you are humble and practice philosophy and seek to purify your soul, and cultivate the virtues and wisdom, and treat others with justice, then you can potentially reach a very pleasant afterlife.
Yeah.
So it's still pagan, it's not a Christian view, but boy, give me that every day of the week over the atomist picture.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanna talk that's so good. I wanna talk about, his theology. I wanna end with that, but before I jump in there, just like a random question, like,
Hmm.
sometimes, Christians, early fathers and stuff will talk really highly of Plato, probably more Plato than Aristotle, because I think his stuff got lost for a while, but,
Hmm.
um, some will say that he was, like, preparing the way.
Hmm.
What and you look at Plato and you see all the stuff, you do see that there's a lot of footnotes to Plato in philosophy today, and you're like, "Well, how did this guy know so much? How the heck did he have all this stuff and so many good arguments back then?" What do you make of Plato? Do you think that, like do you think he just happened to be a really smart guy and figure this out? Or do you think, like, God was leading him and preparing the way to the pagans, like, what do you make of that just, personally?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely some strong versions of this that are out there that
Yeah.
Plato is preparing the pagan world for Jesus the way
Right.
that the old covenant was preparing the Jews for Jesus, and I
Which is
think
totally not true, right? Like,
I
totally
think
not.
yeah, I think parallels that even approach that are too much,
Right.
for me. But I do maybe there's an analog to this. People talk about the way that like the way that the Roman Republic and Empire kind of dominated the Mediterranean and Middle East
Yeah.
during the time of Christ, and so you have all these Roman roadways and safe passage between countries that enabled the quick spread of the gospel. And
Right.
in some sense, that's a providential preparation for the spread of the gospel, the way that it actually spread.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of this is under kind of ordinary providence.
Sure.
Um, but it is fascinating, and I will say this for Greek philosophy, that Jesus came into the world in an area that was controlled by Rome in the Middle East, and the language of the intellectual world at the time was Greek,
Mhm.
and the Jews by that time, in many ways, were already heavily Hellenized in
Mhm.
the sense of engaging with Hellenistic ideas and ways of living. All the intertestamental literature testifies to this range of engagement between the Jews and the Greeks. And so there's kind of this scandal of particularity to the gospel. Jesus was a real person that came in a real time and a real
Yeah.
place, talked to real people in a real intellectual environment, and that was an environment where Plato was part of the intellectual background.
Mhm.
And so I think of it more of general providence than like some kind of special revelation to Plato. I don't think that's there.
Okay.
I think there's a course to history, there's an arc to history, and there were a lot of steps in that story in the 400s and 300s BC in the
Yeah.
ancient Mediterranean world, just like there were at other times in other places. And Plato's just a really cool part of that.
That's awesome.
That is part of the background to the world of Jesus, and the world that the Christians lived in the New Testament era, and down to today. So it's definitely part of God's providential plan
Yeah.
to bring salvation to his people and to spread the gospel around the
Yeah.
world.
I like the way you answer that. I think a lot of times we have a hard time with like the what's called the good bad split of saying like this guy was
Yeah.
good and you won't have to
Yeah.
Christianize him. You don't have to make him a Christian to appreciate his stuff and to take and appropriate some while still being like, but he's a pagan, right? He's not like
Yeah.
not going to lead you to salvation through
Yeah.
reading the dialogues.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think as much as he can do for you is what he did for Augustine, which would be hopefully convince you to not be a materialist,
Hmm.
convince you not to be a relativist or a skeptic,
Skeptic,
to
yeah, sure.
to point you towards higher things, to point you towards value that goes beyond pure pragmatism,
Hmm.
towards goodness and virtue and nobility. But you're not going to get all the way to heaven with just
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
That's really incomplete. And so by the end, you do see him going off the rails in various ways. And
yeah.
I don't shy away from critiquing him at various points in the book. Certain areas I think he does worse than others in, and that's yeah,
Yeah. Well, so I wanted to end with that. You you give so one of your final chapters here is for the divine against atheism, and you give these two strands of Platonic theology. God is a divine craftsman, and then God or the divine is a fundamental principle of all. Are these well? Can you lay out these two strands first, and then are they at odds with each other, or are they in lockstep with each other?
yeah. I do see him as in a bit of tension, as in tension. I think unresolved tension.
Okay.
Maybe if I come back on in 10 years, I'll have resolved the tension. I don't know,
Do it. Yes.
but yeah, we'll see. So I do think there are these two strands of thinking about the divine in Plato. One is most clearly presented in the Timaeus, which includes his
Yeah.
creation account. And in the Timaeus, you have a divine craftsman, the demiurge, who creates the world with intermediaries helping him. And he does not create ex nihilo. He starts by taking over chaotic material stuff that's already there
Mhm.
and forming it and trying to make it as good as possible
Mhm.
because he is good and wants to make the world as good as possible. Plato says that. And so this has God as kind of a personal, creative, not ex nihilo creator, but a kind of craftsman, right? Like someone who takes raw material and shapes it for the good.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of one picture of God that's in Plato. Very very kind of personalized, theistic in that way. The other is a more abstract, I would say, notion of God as a kind of eternal principle of goodness.
Mm.
And I think you see this most clearly in the Republic, in central chapters of the Republic. You have this is where he talks about the famous allegory of the cave, and you have the sun and the lion
Yeah.
illustrations in the same area. And in that whole section where he's talking about uh, the highest things that you know, this is where he talks about episteme and other things too, and he talks about
Okay.
the order of knowledge, how you ascend to higher truths through various processes. And he says there at the end, what you ascend to knowledge of, the highest thing is the good itself.
Mhm.
But there the good is like a principle of goodness that causes everything else to happen the way that it happens. It's not presented as a theistic God, as a
Yeah.
person who acts or cares. It's more like a like you get in the Neoplatonists later on, a kind of divine one
Yeah.
from which everything emanates, not in terms of causal agency, but just in terms of almost you have to cash out as an unthinking process. But even that doesn't quite work though. It's the status is ambiguous. I think
Right.
it's not clear. And so you have this kind of this principle of goodness, and I do think you see that in the Neoplatonist philosophers later on as well. So I see these two as unresolved. In Plato,
Yeah.
does that mean he couldn't have integrated them in a way that is sort of beneath the surface? Maybe I'm not dead set against that being the
Sure.
case, but I think they point towards the way that the early Christians will try to reconcile these things in in God's very person, in God's very
Yeah.
being. And so you see God who is goodness himself for Augustine, right? So Augustine, I really think, brings these strands together very nicely.
Okay.
You have God as goodness itself, and yet also a person who is creator and with the absolute power to create out
Yeah.
of nothing. And so some of these problems or tensions that are unresolved, I think, get resolved in Augustine. Maybe there's a church father before Augustine that resolves them. I don't know, but I think by Augustine, I think you see a bringing together of these things
Yeah.
in a if not fully coherent, at least fairly coherent way,
Yeah.
and to see those two strands brought together. So for me, I'm happy to just leave Augustine as the hero of
Yeah, man. I love that.
my little short story about Plato, and there's lots of threads to be traced, in between there.
So
Uh,
awesome.
but um, but that's kind of where I see that part of the story going.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it famously like puts the forms in the mind of God too, which a lot of
Yeah,
analytic philosophers of religion are working on today, which is
yeah,
fantastic. I love it.
yeah. There's
Really fun stuff.
ongoing issues here, right? Plantinga raises questions about this. Other people raise questions about this. Great
Yeah.
area for ongoing study. Um, so yeah.
Yeah. So do you have any idea when this book will be out for the folks listening?
It's pretty far into the editing process. We've
Awesome.
just gone back and forth with the editors and so forth. I don't know when it'll be open for pre-order.
Yeah.
Maybe this spring, maybe this summer.
Awesome.
But I think if you're going to ETS this fall, that would be kind of check the P&R stand, look for
Nice.
a copy of it there. I think unless something goes awry, we should have printed copies by ETS.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I'll reshare this in the release date and put the
There you go.
link in the description, man. That'd be awesome.
That's great.
I
Appreciate it
really
very
enjoyed
much.
yeah, I really enjoyed this book. This is fantastic. Um, do you have anywhere that you want to plug? So we got this book here, right? But can people find your work anywhere if they wanted to hear from you more?
Eventually, I should update my academia
Yeah,
page
man.
and things like that. So you can follow my Twitter handle, but it's a lot of political commentary too. So I don't know if you want to get into that or not. So
Well, I
yeah,
should say for the audience that that you are a PCA dude, and
yep.
a lot of my audience is like, "Where are all the Calvinist philosophers at?" I'm like, "Well, here we got another one for you
There's
guys. So go
there's
follow him."
there's plenty of Calvinist philosophers out there. We get along just fine.
It's good. I love that. Well, awesome, man. Thanks so much for the book and for your time. This has been really illuminating. Yeah,
Thank you. Appreciate it.
definitely. All right, folks, that's gonna have to do it for now. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.